they're living together and they're doing something together, right? Like this is that vision of people building this culture of sharing and doing things together, and I think that it's a really neat example of how this community is coming together to do something. So we just have a few more slides here just about kind of some technical things about co-housing, like what makes co-housing and what makes it not co-housing and stuff like that. So we thought we'd break it down in one slide that shows how it's similar or different to different things, because this was really helpful for us when we started putting this together. And this is actually based on a document that we found somewhere. So here's just a couple of categories that I'm going to list. Here's a standard condominium, like an apartment or whatever. Here is cooperative housing, which you guys have lots of experience with. So if there's a mistake here, please let me know, because you guys clearly have way more experience than me, just based on what we've been able to find. And here's co-housing. So in terms of shared versus private space, in a standard condominium, there would be almost no shared space. There might be a meeting room or a laundry or something like that. But really, the focus is on private. In cooperative housing, there's different models. So cooperative housing, from what we've learned, is really variable and really flexible. Like there's all kinds, from where you're living in a co-op where you have a bedroom, that's it, and then you share everything else, all the way to you just basically have your own apartment, which you rent from the co-op, and that's all there is to it. Where were you guys on the spectrum there?
Well, where I grew up, it was 50 units of townhouses built in a circle facing each other. So we had, basically, it was a fence all around us. We had gardens, we had a campfire area, and then sort of between each block, we had little yards. So in which we had an ice rink, we had a basketball net, we had a huge community center for meetings and a kitchen, and just tons of like outdoor green space to run around in. It was awesome. And then when we lived in one, it was more of an apartment style, but it was built in a circle still, so we had a common courtyard with a playground and a barbecue area, and we had a big kitchen and a big meeting room. And rooftop patio, and yeah, lots of green space in both of them. Laundry, yeah.
And the ownership in both types was co-op.
Co-op, yeah.
So you would have just to share.
Yeah, so if you could afford to, based on your income, you would pay market value.
Okay.
And then different people with different incomes would be subsidized based on what they can pay.
There's one with the cooperative, which is paying off the mortgage.
Right.
Cooperative.
The non-profit entity
Right.
pays off its mortgage. Right. Okay. Cool. Yeah, that sounds really brilliant. I'd love to visit. Because it sounds really cool.
Yeah, and I mean, for us, when he lost his job, it means that he still had somewhere to live. And especially for some of us,
Single mom.
yeah.
So that's in terms of shared versus private space. In terms of ownership, a condominium comes with a standard ownership model, which in Nova Scotia is governed by the Condominium Act of Nova Scotia. And, you know, I think most people know how a condo works. So you buy the condo and you with a mortgage, and then it pays off over, you pay it over a number of years. Cooperative housing, by definition, the model is cooperative. So that's usually the legal structure. So there's a non-profit entity that actually owns the development or the houses, and then people have a share in that or pay rent to that cooperative entity, which then pays off its loans and its borrowings and stuff like that. So that's cooperative. Co-housing, interestingly enough, is not necessarily either. Co-housing is more the type of living arrangement, but it doesn't say what the financial or legal structure is. So what we've seen in North America is that co-housing is most frequently condominium style. That's just the legal framework under which the co-housings exist. But there are also examples of cooperative co-housing. And in Europe, it seems to me like cooperatives are more common for co-housing than in North America. I'm not 100% sure why that is. It could be because governments in Europe typically spend a lot of money on subsidizing housing, and so co-ops naturally have that. So, but they often get built as condominiums in North America.
Would you still be able to take advantage of all the government funding and programs available?
My understanding is that there is no government funding. in Nova Scotia for cooperatives. Yeah, it's very dry right now. Because I've been talking to people, Cate and I had a conversation with someone who's been living in a co-op in Halifax, and they're basically saying like every year there's just less and less money. Yeah, like the government's really clawed back the amount of dollars for housing. Yeah, so it could just be the political climate or whatever. Yeah. Which is, yeah, again, possibly why the condominium model is the one that's moving forward, because then people have mortgages, right? Like that's how.
Unfortunately, the economic environment's not likely to improve.
It's not like
in the near future,
no,
so you have to keep that.
We don't really know what's going to. Here's another interesting one, which is why do they get built in the first place? So condominiums are built by a developer who wants to generate a profit, right? So the developer comes into a neighborhood and says, I'm going to build 25-unit condo. And then once it's built, or as it's getting built, people buy them. And so it's entirely a market-driven thing. And so the units that get built don't necessarily meet the needs of the residents. It's just the developer who's like, I think people would like this. In cooperative housing, when they get built, they're almost entirely built to create affordable housing. That's the primary purpose generally of cooperative housing for their development stage. Which is, again, possibly one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of new ones. Like there hasn't been any cooperative housing built in Nova Scotia, to my understanding, since the 80s, which is a really long time. But in Europe, they are still getting built. Co-housing, because it's not built by government, typically, it's built by residents. The idea is to create quality, community-oriented housing for the people that are going to live there. So again, slightly different focus in why they get built. And then the last category is just around that initial dollars that you need to build it. So standard condominium developer typically has deep pockets and can cover the upfront costs, and then residents purchase the units outright through mortgages and so on. In cooperative housing, again, very frequently government subsidized or funded, and then the nonprofit, builds the development and then pays back over time. Co-housing is very often developer built and then paid for by the developer and residents, which again goes hand in hand with the fact that it's usually condominium style ownership. Are there any questions about that? Like that's, I try to keep the information kind of simple, but is that clear? Yeah. So it just shows a bit of the landscape of what's out there. Okay. No, not yet.
So is there, for example, social services be interested in a co-housing model? Because I think when we talked before, the sense was that there would or could be units that would be available for low-income families. Would it be through the social services?
Yeah, it varies. We see most co-housings do not actually have low-income units in them. That's what we've noticed from our reading. Some of them have rental units at a low price. One of the issues is that when social services comes in and is asked to subsidize part of the units, they actually have really, really strict rules on what is and what isn't allowed, and they usually go for bare bottom minimum in terms of the quality of the development. So many co-housing groups don't like working with social services to get affordable units into place, because there's a whole, it becomes part of the government system that way, and yeah, and like I said, there's not much money going into it these days. So it really depends, but there may be some opportunities to do some, lower income or variable income type units. But
just to butt in a little bit there too, the co-op that I grew up in is now almost to the point where they paid off their mortgage, which means that they're no longer able to get subsidized units. So then they're looking at an opportunity where people who are paying their housing fees are sort of pooling it and then subsidizing from that area and sort of dividing it that way, which is one way you could do it without government funding.
right. Yeah, so, in looking at the stuff we've been reading about for co-housing, again, regardless of whether it's co-op or condominium style, there's clearly an incredible number of benefits that we've identified, and we just thought we would summarize those here. So obviously, because you're building this you're building this thing with a group of people, you can do it the way that you want it. And one of the ways that we would really like to see happen is to have as much ecological design in the development as possible, including generating its own energy and being as sustainable as possible. You're sharing costs of things like common spaces with other people. It's an opportunity to create intentional communities. So that whole idea of sharing with people, living with people, supporting each other and so on, there's that intentionality, which is really exciting to us. We really like that idea. High quality living. So, co-housings are typically very, very well built because they're built for the long term. They're not just a shoddy development that somebody puts up because the residents really want it to be something where everything is of a high quality as much as possible and just really well built and well designed. It's also an opportunity for long-term investment. So, we're at a life stage right now where we're saying, well, should we put our money into a house or not? How cool would it be for us to be able to put our money into a really neat development where we're going to live, and that's going to be just really, really excellent. So it's an opportunity for us to invest some of our money in that. Resilient and self-sufficient. So as the world changes, and we talked about like the peak oil and stuff like that, we really feel that co-housing offers an incredible number of benefits to living in a world that's very different from what it is right now. And finally, this whole idea of living in community where you can have people who are older, people with young families and so on, because you've designed it for meeting all those different needs. It's really exciting. Similarly, tremendous number of benefits for the community. So, Bridgewater is undergoing a lot of changes right now, and we see that a development like this as being an opportunity to revitalize some neighborhoods around town with a really excellent development. It would expand housing options in the community, which is super valuable, and there's high demand for new kinds of housing.